We can also go into Hinduism and compare the story of Krishna with Matthew and Herod wanting to kill the children to prevent the birth of Jesus. Kansa and Hinduism wanted to prevent the birth of Krishna because the prophecy was said that he was going to be born and basically kill King Kansa, which he did. We can also look at the three magi, or the three wise men, who were called magi in the Old Testament. Who are the magi? The magi goes back to Zoroaster, the creator of Zoroastrianism, which is the worship of Ahura Mazda. Now, when you look at Zoroastrianism, you go to Revelations, and Revelations is talking about 1,000 years that Jesus is going to rule. It's going to be 1,000 years of peace and this and that. That comes from Zoroastrianism. When it's talking about when the sun reaches the neck of Pegasus, there will be 1,000 years of peace. But also, Zoroastrianism is a major clue, because remember before I was talking about Cyrus, king of Persia. Zoroaster was also a Persian. Now remember, it was the Persians who conquered the Phoenician Canaanites. It was the Persians who took control of Israel. So remember I said Cyrus, king of Persia, is in the Bible. If you go to 2 Chronicles 36:23, it's talking about God telling Cyrus, king of Persia, to build a house, to build God's temple in Jerusalem. Because remember, in real life, it was the Persians who had control over Israel. So you got to think about something, because they threw that in there to throw you off, to try to add some validity to the Bible. So if Israel is supposed to be where God's chosen people is, how come in real life the Persians, who are Arabs, conquered Israel? That's not supposed to happen to the end of the world. It's supposed to be where God's chosen people are. How the hell did Arabs conquer it? That's why they threw that in the Bible, so it can make it look like that Cyrus, king of Persia, was on God's side, like he was a Christian. But Cyrus, king of Persia, actually existed. This man was real. Him and Tiberius Caesar are probably the only two people in the Bible who actually are real, who actually existed. So they threw that in there because you got to explain, how in the hell did Cyrus, king of Persia, conquer Israel? So you got to make it look like he is on God's side of the Bible, when we know, in fact, he worshiped Ahura Mazda, just like Zoroaster. He worshiped Ahura Mazda, not the Bible, not the God of the Jews or Hebrews. He conquered them. So to add validity, they had to throw that in there. So like I said, I could have used that to just basically wipe out the Old Testament. But you can see they went to many different places to get the New Testament. And it's a lot more stuff that I left out, but we can see that this is like so many different things that they brought in. But we're going to also show the parallel and the comparison between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So now remember, the Greeks created the Old Testament. So when Titus and Josephus got their hands on all the manuscripts of the Hebrews, and they was going through it, when all the Greek scholars and everybody was going through all this information, they had to come up with a new Messiah. So when they was creating Jesus, he paralleled Joseph in the Old Testament in a lot of different ways, because they just didn't know, I guess, how they was going to do it. But really, when you look at the Bible today, when you look at a lot of the wars that was going on between the Jews and the Roman Empire, what they did was switch it around and make it like the Jews won those wars. So basically, they was trying to make it look like in the beginning that when you worship in Jesus Christ, you also worship in Titus. So when we compare Joseph, Old Testament, with Jesus, New Testament, check this out. So we see that Joseph he was a miracle birth. Jesus was also a miracle birth. Joseph was one of 12 brothers. Jesus had 12 disciples. Joseph was sold for 20 pieces of silver, and Jesus was sold for 30 pieces. Judah suggests the sale of Joseph. Judas suggests the sale of Jesus. Joseph started his ministry at 30, and Jesus started his at 30. So when you start looking at these, we can see what they was trying to do. They was trying to give them something from the Old Testament and bring it over to the New Testament, which is why Jesus parallels Joseph in a lot of different ways. But it's not just Joseph, it's other things we can look at. So now, when we look at the Old Testament, we can actually compare it to some of the things that happened to Jesus in the New Testament. So when we start to look at things like this, we see that in the Old Testament, the Jews, remember, they went from Egypt to Israel. We know that Joseph took Jesus from Israel to Egypt. We know that Joseph, he went to Egypt in the Old Testament. He also goes to Egypt in the New Testament. We know that Pharaoh tries to kill kids in the Old Testament, and we know that Herod tries to kill kids in the New Testament. We also know that the Israelites walked through water. They passed through water because Moses parted the Red Sea. We also know that Jesus passes through water when he is baptized. We know that the Israelites spent 40 years in the wilderness. 40 years. We know that Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness. So when you start to look at the comparison, we can see that they are identical in a lot of different ways, more than what I just said. So we can basically end this whole part you just seen was my external view of the Bible. So I wanted to give you the history of the Bible so I can finally answer this question of why the hell did they wait so long to give us the King James Version when they already had Vaticanus, when they had Sinaiticus, when they were sitting on Alexandrinus? What was the wait all about? So now, remember, it was the Greeks who conquered the Persians, and then Rome conquered the Greeks. But the Persians returned in 92 BC, and they fought a long war that lasted all the way till 627 AD against Rome. So while the Council of Nicaea was going on, while the Codex Vaticanus and Sinaiticus and Ethon Rescriptus and Alexandrinus and all that was being written and put together, Rome was still at war with Persia. Now, it's weird to me that after the war ended with Persia, that Islam comes into play. So Muhammad was supposed to be born around 5-something, the 6th century, and then right after the war is over with Rome, you have Islam. And we know that Islam has the Old Testament. So it's suspect. So if you've seen my video on Islam, and I definitely recommend you watch that video because it'll give you some clarity, we see that these people were Arab 1 minute, Jews or Christians, then all of a sudden Muslim. So we know that they was out there spreading the word. Rome was out there preaching this whole Bible. They was preaching the Vulgate and preaching Vetus Latina. So right after the Council of Nicaea, when they made Codex Vaticanus and Codex Sinaiticus, a civil war broke out in Rome from 350 to 394 AD. Now, some scholars believe that they actually tried to preach this New Testament gospel, and they tried to preach some of the stuff that was in Vaticanus, and the people wasn't having it. But a civil war broke out right around the time, during the time when they was fighting with Persia. So it's weird, that broke out, that happened, and all of a sudden, boom, you don't see Sinaiticus, you don't hear nothing about Codex Vaticanus, and like I said, they put it in the Vatican Library and it sat there for over 1,000 years. Why? So that's suspect. Now, when the war ends with Persia, which it basically ended in status quo, a status quo. So you got status quo antebellum, which basically means you get to keep what you came in the war with, I get to keep what I came in the war with. So myself and other scholars all agree that some kind of deal must have been made to where Rome would allow these Arabs to use the Old Testament, because we know that Islam came out right after this whole truce, this status quo antebellum was over, then we get Islam. So Islam has the Old Testament. Why would they risk using the Old Testament if Rome did not allow them to do so? So we know the 11th century came and the whole Crusades happened, and Rome basically wiped out any other religions that was like in that area around that time, and Islam remained. So I'm going to show you later why it remained and what's going on, what was that whole deal about, and we're going to find it because the Bible is telling you what's in there and what happened. So we're going to get into that, explain what this book really is, because it's not just what I've been saying, as far as like copying Greek mythology and all this and that, because we know the Old Testament is basically the worship of Ares. Judaism is basically, the ram, the lamb, Ares, the lamb, or Ares, the ram. And we know that the New Testament, we could say, is Zeus. Jesus, Zeus. We can say that. But there's also a deeper hidden meaning. A hidden meaning inside the Bible that we're going to go through, and I will explain in this next part, which is going to be almost completely dealing with the Bible itself and everything that's inside of it. So now, one of the things I want you to remember real quick is, who gave you your Bible? Rome gave you your Bible. Who translated it? The Greeks. Romans and Greeks translated this book. So why would you expect your enemy to give you the truth? Why would you expect them to do that? Think about that. So this is the thing I've been trying to tell Christians, is you got to remember, your Bible came from Rome. Rome gave you your Bible. Everything that King James used to create the King James Version came from Rome. So why would they? First of all, one, they're already enslaving black people. So why would they give you any kind of truth when their goal is global domination? Why would they give you any truth? So you accepting everything that they're saying, and you're not even realizing that this is your enemy. These are the people who have been against you since the beginning. Remember, Rome runs America. They run it. Remember how the Senate, how we have a Senate, just like Rome has a Senate. Everything is set up just like the Caesar system was set up there in America. It's the same thing. Rome runs it. So how can you expect them to give you any kind of truth? You can't rely on them. So remember, as we go into this book, remember, your enemy gave you this book. But somebody else coded it, and they coded it for a reason. We're going to get into that. But remember, your enemy gave you this book. So don't expect them to give you any kind of truth. And what we're going to use when we get into this process is a lot of common fucking sense. Okay, so let me summarize before I get into the actual Bible itself, before I get into the code, before I get into the contradictions and the prophecies. Now, Rome, bottom line, Rome gave you your Bible. It was Rome. Rome, after they took over the Greeks who wrote the Old Testament, and we don't know what the Old Testament originally said because we don't have it. The closest thing we have to the original Old Testament is the Dead Sea Scrolls, which are different from the Old Testament that you have today. Understand it. Rome gave you your Bible, gave you your New Testament, and the Bible, complete King James Version, to control the people. They did it because the Hebrews rebelled against Rome, and they was controlling them under the Old Testament, having them believe that Messiah was going to come and lead them to rebellion against Rome. So when that didn't happen, they had to give them a new testament, a new covenant, and that's what they did. So that's what the Bible was about, giving people this doctrine. They controlled the Jews with it, so why not control everybody else we can control with this religious doctrine? So understand, it was the Titus Flavius dynasty. It was the whole Flavius dynasty. Vespasius Flavius, Titus Flavius. With the help of Josephus and others, they gave you your Bible. This was the 1st century dynasty, the 1st century in Rome. When was the Roman Catholic Church started? In the 1st century. It's not hard to put this together. When you look at the whole dates of all this stuff, it all goes into that same time frame, the 1st century under the Titus dynasty. The Arch of Titus in Rome is showing you exactly what happened. It's there. All the proof is in Rome, period. They gave you your Bible.